Um, so as I mentioned, this is the last class of the semester, and by coincidence, um, over the last number of days, both the the New Democratic Party of Canada and the Liberal Party of Canada held national conventions. These were virtual conventions, but political parties, and this is partly tied to what the chapter described as Weber's compromise, allegedly a compromise between, on the one hand, Marx's conflict theory of classes, and on the other hand, the structural functionalist account of classes. And positioning Weber as a compromise is, at least pedagogically, but I think more than just pedagogically, it's meant to be a mediating position between what are seen as two methodologically extreme positions, which, when practiced in their extremes, don't seem to correspond to the empirical facts that we're presented with when we take a look through a sociological lens at how society is organized, but also, in some instances anyway, seem to not correspond to our lived experience of how class organizes human society for the most part. And so Weber and the compromise position that's attributed to him defends the claim and tries to provide evidence for the accuracy and the rigor of his claim that in capitalist societies there are other frameworks that compete with, strictly speaking, class-based frameworks. They compete with them in the organization of that society. And for Weber and for many, many sociologists right up until today, the clearest evidence of that is that there are other sources of power in society other than simply money. That money motivates, but other things motivate as well. And many sociologists argue that it follows from that a strictly wealth-based theory of class automatically is false because of that. And the one of the more influential components of Weber's broader and more complex position on this score is the notion of parties, how political parties are an intervening social mechanism that moderates and in some ways pushes back against the ability of wealth to determine how society is organized. And so it's in order to fill out a little bit of the detail and in order to see how that works, we have the example of the Liberal Party and the New Democratic Party over the last few days. So this is hot off the press stuff, getting together in a semi-public way, in a fairly transparent, fairly public way, to debate amongst themselves. But they debate amongst themselves, again, in a fairly public way, what their party claims to be about. And it's organized, the timing of this is not neutral. So in Canada, there are three main national political parties: the Conservative Party, the New Democratic Party, and the Liberal Party. There's a national Green Party, and the Green Party runs candidates. As far as I know, in the last election, they ran candidates in every riding in Canada. I'm not 100% sure of that, but they only elected 2 or 3 members of parliament. And so in terms of the actual deliberations in the National Parliament of Canada, the Green Party is not, at least not yet, an influential factor. The three national parties, that is, parties that have candidates all across the country, are the New Democratic Party, the Liberal Party, and the Conservative Party. And the Conservative Party didn't have a national convention because they recently elected a new leader. And largely speaking, the election of the new leader, Aaron O'Toole, functioned as a national convention. That was a few weeks ago. So all three national parties recently got together, and by and large, the explanation for that is a timing issue. The current federal parliament is composed, the Liberal Party currently leads parliament as a minority government, which means what? What is a minority government? Canada has a national parliament, and Canada is divided into provinces and territories, and each province and territory has their own provincial or territorial legislation. But at the national level, the federal parliament, the House of Commons, which is in Ottawa, Ottawa is our national capital, has 338 members. The country is divided into 338, they're called ridings, and the name riding is derived from it has a historical derivation. Our parliamentary system is largely based on the British parliamentary system. And in Britain, historically, the country was divided into ridings, and it was supposedly how far you could ride on a horse in one day. And England was divided into, roughly speaking, geographically equal sub areas. In Canada, it's no longer, and it never was, divided in that way. They just retained the name. And roughly speaking, each riding is supposed to include 100,000 voters. And how the boundaries are set is complicated. And it's not a trivial matter, but it's not the most important matter. There are 338 ridings, and at each federal election, the eligible voters in those ridings select a member to represent that riding at the national parliament, and the party that wins the most seats forms the government. In the most recent federal election, no party won enough seats to be able to have a majority in parliament, and so that's called a minority government. And what one of the things that means is that in order for a law to be passed, so in Parliament, in order for a law to pass, it has to have the majority of the votes of the people, of the members present on that day. And so for any laws to pass, the current government, which is formed by the Liberal Party, needs to get votes from other parties, from members of other parties. And so one of the things that typically produces is that the ruling party, whichever party that turns out to be, needs to propose legislation that is appealing to not just their own voters, but to voters from other parties. And the connection with stratification is that, by and large, because of the way wealth is stratified in a society, democratic societies uh, cannot mathematically be organized solely on the basis of support from the wealthiest people. And so what it looks like is that a democratic form of government guarantees limitations on the ability of an economically stratified society to organize itself solely in the interests of the wealthiest portion of the population. Um, and so, on that basis, the Weber's compromise, looks like the most plausible explanation for what has happened in the years since Marx first developed his class-based theory of social stratification. What it looks like, at least, and most sociologists, not me, but most sociologists believe that this is methodologically consistent with the evidence that's been presented and with all kinds of other considerations. What it looks like is that in order to be able to form a majority government, a democratic coalition has to appeal not only to the very wealthiest, but has to put forward policies and develop a society in which uh, wealth is not the only measure of influence. And so I want to turn now to take a look at some of the elements of what it is that the NDP voted on. So the NDP and the Liberal Party in their convention, what they did was they voted on a number of proposals, policy proposals, that they will take into the next election. Because it's a minority government, which, just to repeat, a minority government is a government in which is a parliament in which no party has the majority of the votes, so that every vote potentially the government could lose, is less stable and lasts less long. In Canada, the Canadian Constitution requires an election at least every 5 years. And so the government, when there's an election and a party wins a majority, they can't stay in power indefinitely. They are required by the Canadian Constitution to call an election at least within 5 years following the last election. And for a number of strategic considerations, the Liberal Party, chief of which is the Liberal Party is ahead in the polls. And from given that the Liberal Party is ahead in the polls, it makes sense for them to seek re-election because those are the ideal conditions. And so there's broad consensus among critics and supporters alike of the Liberal Party and in the media that the Liberal Party is almost certain to call an election either this spring or in the fall. And this third wave in the COVID makes it less likely that they'd want to call an election in the coming weeks. And for a number of practical and historical reasons, governing parties are highly disinclined to have elections in the summer. It's just harder to get people to pay attention, harder to get people to turn out. So if the election isn't called for the spring, then there's a very good chance that it will be held in the fall. And so the party conventions right now are setting the stage for, and they're testing out what their election campaign party platforms are likely to be. And so we're going to take a look and turn at the NDP convention policy and the Liberal Party convention policies that were adopted and try to see how they relate to, in particular, social stratification. So I'm going to turn now from this screen and I'm going to take a look at the different conventions. And so I'll turn first to the Liberal Party. So this is the Liberal Party website from Convention 2021. And these websites are, of course, set up and designed by consultants in order to be part of the branding and the marketing of the Liberal Party to make it to maximize its chances of attracting more voters and maintaining and retaining their current voters. So the Liberal Party passed 26 policy resolutions, and these are available on the internet, and I invite all of you to take a look at them. So from a stratification point of view, there are a number of interesting features of what went through. So in particular, the universal basic income or Canadian basic income were passed. And let me just see how it looks. What wasn't passed, so what was proposed but not passed in the Liberal Party, but a version of which was passed in the NDP convention, was a tax on the wealthy. And so we have the Liberal Party is positioning itself to support a universal basic income for Canada. Does anyone know what a universal basic income is? What is a universal basic income? Not quite. So I wouldn't get I wouldn't get money out of a universal. I wouldn't directly anyway benefit from a universal basic income as long as I keep my job. As a full-time employed person, I wouldn't get it. What the guaranteed basic income guarantees is that everyone in Canada will have a floor. There'll be a minimum amount of money that everybody in Canada is guaranteed to have. But in order to qualify for it, you don't qualify for it if you have a job. And so my job pays very well, and so I wouldn't qualify for a minimum for the guaranteed basic income. But anybody who doesn't have a job would qualify for it. Now, what possible reasons would there be from a broad social point of view of having a universal basic income? So just so we're clear, what that means is the money that we pay in taxes. So right, that's the central concern is what Mohammed just brought up. So, but I want to frame it just a little bit more broadly in order to have that discussion. Where the money doesn't come from some magic money tree, right? The government collects taxes from everybody in Canada, and there are basically two kinds of taxes. There's income tax and there's consumption tax. And so everything we buy, almost everything we buy, is taxed. That's a consumption tax, excise tax, these kinds of things. And almost all the money we earn is potentially anyway taxable. So there's tax on our income and there's tax on our spending. That generates enormous amounts of money. And out of that money, the government pays for all the services it provides, and also pays for the debt that it's accumulated over the years to pay for those services that it provides. And so out of all that revenue, the universal income would get paid. Now, Mohammed, then wouldn't people who choose not to work just live off of this? We'll start for example, with me, no, because I make a lot more money than what this basic guaranteed income would provide. So it's not the case that everybody would quit. Uh, I have a very nice life that I'm very happy with. Overall, anyway, and I wouldn't be able to afford the things that I can afford now on that basic income. So for me, it's not it wouldn't be an option like that. So what say you, Mohammed? It's not going to, it doesn't pay very much at all. Well, it would depend how much, right. So the basic, the details of the basic income in general, I haven't taken a look, I'm afraid, at the specific proposals that were passed either by the NDP or by the Liberal Party. But I've been following this debate for a number of years. And in general, it's geared to income by family unit. So if someone is, if one of the parents is a college professor and the other parent doesn't work, doesn't have a paid job, the way that the minimum threshold, the maximum threshold to qualify is based on the family income of the two partners. So no, that wouldn't happen. The other feature to keep in mind that's built into the basic income proposal is that it would replace a number of other current income support programs. And so universal basic incomes have been implemented elsewhere, and they've even been implemented in Canada in the past. In Manitoba in the 1970s, I think it's two different cities organized a universal basic income pilot project in order to see what the advantages and disadvantages would be. Because in principle, abstractly, many people are concerned that if someone has the option of either getting money just not to work, one of the consequences might be that that will raise wages for everyone else, that employers won't be able to get people to work, since everybody will have the option of having this minimum level of income. And so the concern would be that it would raise the minimum amount of money that it would require an employer to find workers. And the consequence of that would be that it would raise the cost of living. In those areas where these programs have been passed, that has not yet been shown to be the consequence of basic income programs. It sort of makes sense given assumptions that many people share about why people work, about the impact of wages on people's willingness to work, especially in low-wage jobs. But these assumptions are not yet really fully tested. More recently, not in the most recent Ontario provincial election, but in the previous Ontario provincial election, the Liberal Party, which won that previous election, when it was in power, it implemented a pilot project in a number of communities. I think it was 3 or 4 communities where they were going to test out the universal basic income in Ontario. And they were going to use the pilot project, to evaluate how much money it cost compared to how much money it saved. But the pilot project was canceled by the current Conservative government. One of the first things they did when they came into power 2 or 3 years ago now, I forget, was they canceled the program. And so we weren't able to, we as a society weren't able to test the the consequences of it. And one of the proposed benefits of a universal basic income is that by providing that basic income, what it does is it provides people at the bottom end of the socioeconomic scale opportunities that they otherwise wouldn't have. And the idea is, and it's very well supported in other ways. It's very well empirically supported in other ways that if you provide enough resources early on in the lives of children in poor families, their results in school are improved, meaning that they do better in school early, they do better in school late, and therefore when they become adults, they're in a better position to participate in the economy. Now, that's not just a benefit to the child who grows up in a poor family, so that when that child graduates later on, if everything works from university, it's not just that that child, now an adult, is going to earn a better salary than they otherwise would have. It's that they're going to be in a position to produce for all of society better. The idea is that everybody wins. That's the logic that's at work, and why why what we're doing right now is subsidized by Ontario taxes. It's not because everyone in Ontario wants each of you to get a better paying job. It's not only because everyone in Ontario wants each one of you to get a better paying job. It's also because because there's very, very good reason to believe, it's amply demonstrated, not just in Ontario, but around the world, that a labor force that has a better educated labor force is, economically speaking, more productive. More gets produced overall at a lower cost. More goods and services get produced at a lower cost by an educated population compared to a less well-educated population. So the money that's spent on a basic income program, some of that money means that other students that would otherwise not succeed as well in school are going to succeed better. And over time, that generates a savings, or generates a benefit to society. Another important element is that has been demonstrated in those places and in those jurisdictions that have implemented a universal basic income, and also much more broadly has been demonstrated in lots of other ways, is that because, and COVID is reinforcing one half of this argument, even with universal health care, as we have in Ontario and in Canada, and it should be in quotes, universal health care, health outcomes are still, health outcomes in Canada still correlate to socioeconomic status. Everything else remaining the same, poor people have less good health outcomes than rich people do. So that the universal basic income, another argument that's put forward in favor of universal basic incomes, not just in Canada, but everywhere around the world, an argument is that it, in fact, decreases the cost over a person's lifetime if, when they're young, they have better health, they have better health outcomes as children. The savings over the life of that child, so that there is overall savings to the health system over the lifespan of a person if they have better health care when they're young. So that the idea would be that money that's spent on families that have children, poor families that have children, means that those kids are less sick when they're young. And the evidence is very, very strong in public epidemiology. These numbers are tracked very carefully now. We know that overall, less money is required for that person's health over their lifetime. And in Canada, in Ontario, and in many, many places, not the US, but in many, many other places where there is public health care, the money spent on a universal basic income means money saved in the provision of health care for that society. So those are two important considerations that are available, that are separate from another kind of consideration that some people find compelling and other people don't find compelling, and that is just basic justice. So now Mohammed asks the question, so it isn't enough to live off of. That's a subjective or there's a subjective component to that. So for example, just to broaden the framework a little bit and bring in other aspects of the news. In the United States, right now, the U.S. Congress is considering what is called an infrastructure bill. And they're proposing to spend, right now the proposal is $2 trillion. And one of the big components of what they're proposing, actually, it's probably in here too. Let me just go to the Liberal Convention here. Well, it doesn't seem to be. Here it is, improving internet infrastructure. Now, and I want to relate this to Mohammed's question about enough to live on. So basically, do you think that having a smartphone and an internet connection is in 2021 a necessity or a luxury? I'm asking. So Noor so Noor and Mustafa agree that it's a necessity. If it's typically what we mean in sociology by a necessity is something that society owes to all the members of that society. And the reason that that's a sociological claim rather than, say, a philosophical claim or some other claim is that in sociology, what we mean by a necessity is it's based on the premise, let's say, that in order for any given society to survive, some minimal threshold of life opportunities have to be made available to the members of that society. Absent that minimum threshold, social solidarity, the minimum amount of social solidarity that's required for that society to be able to continue in existence, it disappears and the society breaks apart internally. So if we agree that internet and smartphones are a necessity, that means that we agree that a life worth living includes having that. So we understand that a certain amount of food is a necessity for living. In that sense, it's a kind of strict, objective, biological necessity. You don't get, 1,200 calories a day, you're going to get sick. And I'm not sure about the number, but there's some amount of food that we all need every day or every other day. I mean, I'm not sure about the daily thing, but by and large, you can't even live, never mind operate efficiently in society without food. Many people believe that in order to operate properly, in order to operate not only to your own satisfaction as a human, but as a performing citizen in our society, in 2021, you need a phone. Typically, anyway, you need a phone and an internet connection. Someone has to pay for that. And so the idea is that the government is accepting the necessity to pay for that. How are we supposed to decide? So Mohammed's question, and that's a very difficult policy question. How would we come up with the answer? What is the minimum amount of money that would be required for an income to count as a universal basic income? I'm asking this question. What is it you would think would be what are some of the questions that would have to be answered in order to be able to come up with a policy like that? Well, EI is a little bit more complicated than that because it's based on how much money you were earning. CERB is much closer. Okay, so now Mohammed keeps circling back to a series of concerns. Why would it depend on that? And also, just I want to make a distinction here, Mohammed. Uh, Part of the Weber compromise between the straightforward structural functionalist account and the Marxist conflict account is that the government is constrained in its actions by coalitions of sections of the population that aren't reducible to any one section. So against the some version of the structural functionalist account, what we don't have in even the most economically unequal society are political parties that get elected by the majority of the population that say that they're against that the only thing they're interested in is making the rich richer. Also, what we don't get, for reasons that I don't really understand, but we don't get this, is the election of parties that say, forget about the rich. We're just going to tax. We're going to set the tax level so that everyone gets an equal amount of money. 50% of the wealth in our country is owned and controlled by less than 1% of the total population. If 51% of the total population really was able to organize and control government based on its own interests, Canadian society would look completely different. Our society doesn't work that way. So that the government is constrained in its actions by what society says. And that's why that's one of the reasons why the Liberal Party and the NDP and the Conservative Party have these conventions. That's so that they can come up with ideas that will get them elected. And the Liberal Party and the NDP think that having this idea might get them elected. So if they form the government, they're going to, well, we'll see. If they form the government, maybe they'll put these plans into place. And so what is it? But so that's what's going on here. I want to distinguish between what the government is, what the government does, and how it is that the government gets into place and what goes into organizing the ideas that the government is going to act on. So now, why would we worry, Mohammed? Since you raised the issue, why would we worry about what they spend the money on? We don't worry about what millionaires spend their money on. Well, sure. Let's agree that it's technically, I think it's even more than that, more than just technically our money from taxes. But one of the things about money is that once it's your money, you get to decide how to spend it. And in a capitalist economy, uh, that's very, very near to the ideological core of how a capitalist marketplace operates. The idea of a capitalist marketplace is that a capitalist market operates best when individual consumers freely divert their money, their resources to what it is they want, demand, and actors in that marketplace on the supply side meet that demand in the most efficient way. So that the capitalist idea would be to divert that money to the people that it's targeted to, and then supply them with what it is that they want. So part of what's happened in the last 50 years or so is let me just see if I can get it Socratically get it out of you. What concerns would you have about how they're going to spend their money? Is there any doubt about what they would spend that money on? Drug addicts can't control themselves. I'm not sure what that has to do with anything, but uh, drug addiction is an illness. And so that they can't control themselves is the description of their illness. And in Canada, and in many, many places, the idea is that the advantage to the rest of society of curing illnesses is that it increases the pool of people that are available to increase the productivity of that society. And by increasing the productivity of that society, everybody's standard of living is raised. And so while it's true, or rather, even if it's true that, excuse me, money that was money diverted from your pocket and my pocket, our tax money would go to someone who gets a universal basic income, would then spend that money on drugs instead of spending it on broccoli or on their kids' pencils so that they can go to school. The idea is the goal of the policy is to create conditions in which the advantages that emerge from making that money available allow people to move out of all of the other negative consequences that exist as a result of poverty. The underlying sociological premise is that poverty itself is the cause of the problem, of most of the problems, most of the social level problems, and that by eliminating poverty, we cure those problems, we fix those problems. There's some evidence, I think that it's very good evidence, but it's limited evidence that suggests that drug addicts presented with the alternative to continuing in their drug addictions want to stop using drugs. And so that a universal basic income in a context where drug addiction counseling is made available, where the pressure is off of the addict to make a living so that they can feed their habits, where drug addicts are offered the possibility of kicking their habit, They do. And so now that it's mixed evidence for sure, and there's a strong, widely held view that's not supported by very much science that drug addiction is just a willpower question. That if the drug addicts simply don't have enough willpower to control themselves, that doesn't have much scientific support, although it is very widely held. It's just thought to be a weakness of the will on the part of the people who are using the drugs. Uh, that's a subcategory of one of the concerns. But more broadly, the idea would be that they're going to take that first of all, it's rhetorically structured in a us and they way. So there's us working taxpayers who are supporting them lazy no goods. And the evidence we have doesn't support that characterization. The evidence we have, the myths about poverty are that poor people are just too lazy to pull themselves together. And it's more or less an extension of that myth that worries that the universal basic income will effectively reproduce the negative outcomes. The universal basic income is intended to cure the problems that are caused by poverty rather than reproducing the very conditions that poverty encourages. Now, the part of the main point I wanted to make, though, was to call to your attention that social stratification is an important component. And if we look at the policy proposals, a number of these are organized around mitigating some of the social consequences of the particular income and wealth distribution in Canadian society. And so the Liberal Party is positioning itself to decrease the extent to which Canada is a socially stratified society. And the NDP also, so I'll switch over. Hang on here. I've almost run out of time, but I want to. Okay, let me see if I can get this. Okay, it's back to me. Share application. So here, innovating and prospering in a new energy economy, investing in Canada where no one is left behind, governing in an inclusive and fair Canada. They chose, these are different sections, and so let's just quickly go to section 3. Yeah, it's not exact. Fighting poverty with a guaranteed basic income, improving long-term care. There's a number of resolutions here. We don't really have time to go through them. I encourage you to take a look at these, both the NDP and the Liberal and the Conservative policy proposals. The main point is, from a sociology point of view, from a stratification point of view, is that the political parties are positioning themselves to put together a coalition of voters based on how the parties understand stratification to track onto different policy proposals. A green energy. So, for example, the Conservative Party, when they gathered to elect, when they gathered in their policy convention, they rejected adopting a green energy policy, even though it was recommended by the party leadership. And so we have the Conservative Party organizing itself around a certain set of policies, whereas the Liberals and the NDPs, and they're all going after the same voter. Now, the point I want to end on here has to do with how one of the central misunderstandings that students especially students who are beginning to study sociology, have about what sociological theory is trying to do. And in a way, what sociological theories are trying to do is the same thing that the NDP leadership and the Liberal leadership and the Conservative Party leadership are trying to do. The Liberals understand, the Liberals, the NDP, and the Conservatives understand that there's only 17 or 18 million voters out there in the next election, and that they're interested in, and or their interests are served by reaching the maximum amount of voters that they can. And so what they need to do is, there's only one reality out there. There's only one pool of voters out there, and they've got to try to come up with policies that will be attractive to the greatest number of voters. Likewise, sociological theories are proposing to come up with a conceptual framework that does the best job at explaining that one reality out there. So when a sociologist asks a question about what is a basic income going to do, they're interested in trying to understand what consequences are there going to be for a given society in which a basic income is going to be proposed. Or another example that the NDP and the Liberal Party are have both endorsed is a national pharmacare program. What are the predictable consequences in Canada in the near and medium and long term if we pool our resources, our economic resources as a country, in order to pay for the medication that everyone gets? Is it going to be who is it going to be a net gain for, and how is society overall going to benefit? Okay, so we've run out of time. I'm going to turn the recording off now.